$10 for
recording in progress.
I have no audio from you guys. Do you want to talk to me at all? Hey,
Good
there
evening,
you are.
Jared. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'll tell you what, give me just a second. I'm trying to make it so you can see some humans in here.
I see humans.
Is there a volume?
That's what I'm trying to. I'll tell you what, give me 1 minute because.
A young man. Hey man, how are you? All right. Haven't seen you in a couple days. Back in the winter, that was good. I saw you.
Hey Joe,
On Facebook.
do you know how to remotely turn up the volume on my computer? No, it's like not loud enough. I can't hear him.
Oh, okay.
That's my computer though. My computer speakers aren't up, but I can't turn them up.
You could just yell the whole time. You have a volume control panel somewhere on like a set it system. Yeah, system preferences. This is a Mac, isn't it?
Young man.
You have
Sound.
output, input.
There we go.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Tell you what, can we do testing real quick? Can we see if they hear you?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
That's awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. All right. We are
Hey,
ready.
What kind of screen are you guys looking at?
So you are actually projected onto our big screen in the Ross Township Administration Building. So
Okay,
they
looks pretty bright in there. Does it look okay?
yeah, your picture looks great. Everybody see this up here? Okay. Are you going to share your screen with us?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll pull some more blinds.
Yeah, when you're ready.
Can we flip the lights in?
If you want to go ahead and introduce them, you will.
Okay. I don't know where to stand where he can see me. Okay. All right. You're not going to see me.
That's okay.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the meeting. We're going to start promptly here. This is Dr. Jared Burks, and he's going to teach us about the Fortified Hill site and what he does and how they were able to save that site within the last couple years. So without further ado, Dr. Burks, go ahead.
All righty. To be honest, there isn't a ton to tell you about Fortified Hill. I do have some images and slides of that, but I thought I would step back a sec from that to give you some context of what is Fortified Hill. Even though we know next to nothing about the place, realistically, we know a ton about other places like it. And so as we do more work at Fortified Hill, and I mean, we're really at just the beginning, these are some of the things that we could learn about it. So what I need to know from you guys is what kind of interest level in this archaeology stuff do you have? Because I can talk all night. I know this is supposed to be a 1-hour meeting, and I will shoot to keep it under that. But are you guys like super excited about it? Woo, jump up and down. Or are you more like 15 minutes excited about it?
Well, location of Fortified Hills, for one, and who created it, how it was created, timeline for that when that took place, and the maybe how it was rediscovered, if you will.
Okay.
And also other sites, you know, in and around that have to do with the same Indian cultures.
Yeah. That's where we can get extending into, you know, infinity time. But first, Alyssa, you'll have to allow me to share my screen. It's not enabled at the moment.
Okay.
I know you want to look at me for the next hour, but it would probably be more interesting to look at my slides.
All right.
Is this you guys' first in-person meeting?
Yes. Well, yes and no.
Sort of.
Yeah, kind of.
Had a few in person.
Can you share it now?
Yes.
But this is the most in persons that we have. Yes.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Which is basically your screen. Okay, here we are. My wee little talk. Okay. So I'm going to start by backing up to Ohio before we zoom in on the Fortified Hill site. As you guys probably know, Ohio is loaded with earthwork sites. And by earthworks, I usually mean sites with enclosures of some sort, but obviously mounds are earthworks too. So if we look at just enclosure sites, as of 1914, there were almost 600 of these things recorded in Ohio. And I suspect now the number is going to be closer to 2,000 if I have my way. But the number keeps climbing as we keep finding more. But tons of them all over the place. They are concentrated for sure in the Miami valleys, in the Scioto Valley, especially around Ross County. A whole bunch of them there in Licking County around Newark. And then you'll notice there's kind of a sort of a linear distribution of them there, and they're following the kind of the termination of the last glacial advance. So kind of where the flatness of northwestern Ohio becomes the rugged hills of southern and southeastern Ohio. These folks who built these earthworks just loved this sort of corridor through central Ohio here. In addition to enclosure sites, and each enclosure site may have one or it could have 20 enclosures. So there's a lot more little enclosures at some of these places. But in addition to these enclosures, there are well over 10,000 mounds in Ohio. We don't actually know the real number because so many of them were destroyed before people started counting them. More are destroyed every single day, I suspect, in the state, but there are tons that have never been recorded. So we don't actually know how many are here. Let's just say lots and lots. A really interesting factoid is almost all of this earth moving happened in a 700-year period between 300 BC and AD 400. And you're probably familiar with the terms Edina and Hopewell. These are terms that an archaeologist came up with in the early 1900s to refer to what they thought were sort of culture groups that made the mounds in Ohio. And the Edina came first. They made the big conical mounds that are all over the place. And in your neck of the woods, the Miamisburg Mound is Edina, as you probably know. And then they also started making enclosure sites, especially the circular ones. And then, you know, their great-grandchildren, essentially, that's who the Hopewell are, really got hooked on enclosures and started building them everywhere, tons of them, all over the place. And that's where my interest gets piqued in locating these enclosure sites. So the kinds of things we have to find in Ohio are geometric shapes, as you probably know. And in these old maps here, the dark line there is a ditch that's been dug into the ground, and the sort of fainter shape around it is an embankment of soil built up around the ditch. So these circular things are pretty common. There must be hundreds and hundreds of these sites in Ohio. Some of Ohio's earthworks, geometric earthworks, are quite large. Still geometric though, and if you're sitting close enough to the screen there, maybe you can see this number I'm circling with the pointer here. That says 1,080, and that's feet. So these very large enclosure sites are, well, very large. They're enormous. They sort of baffle the mind how big they are. And then we have these really strange shaped enclosures. And these are built in very particular places. You may recognize that one, the Fort Ancient site. It's not far from you there. These are called hilltop enclosures, and their shape is usually related to the shape of the hilltop they're built on. And as you guessed it, this is what fortified hill is. It is a hilltop enclosure. There are, oh gosh, I don't know how many sites there are. There must be, well, I can say dozens and dozens. We don't know the exact number of hilltop enclosure sites because they range from this really complicated one, Fort Ancient, all the way down to very simple ones with just one embankment. So fortified hill is somewhere in between. I think it's more like this complicated Fort Ancient site, only much smaller. Fort Ancient there, by the way, is 100 acres inside there, quite big. Okay, so I mentioned that the enclosures, especially the geometrics, often have ditches with them, and that's me standing in a great big ditch in Newark at the Great Circle. If you want to go see, I don't know, maybe the best preserved earthwork site in Ohio, one of the best, and sort of the what it used to look like kind of example, go to Newark and check out the Great Circle. It's in a little park. It's easy to access. And it's amazingly large. It's 1,200 feet in diameter, so quite big. And you can see the embankment there to my right. And then to my left is the inside of the enclosure. And I want to point that out because that's where all the special stuff happened oftentimes at these earthwork sites, inside the enclosures. There's a lot going on inside of them. So for instance, Mound City here at Chillicothe, the inside of this enclosure is filled with mounds. And you might call these burial mounds, but that would be incorrect. The mounds themselves are more like caps or monuments to a place. They say, hey, look, there was something here that was very important. And we're just going to put some dirt here and cover it up to keep all that stuff down there. So Hopewell mounds and Mound City is a Hopewell site, cover the foundation of a building. And I've got a drawing there of kind of a blueprint of the foundation of the building there. These are buildings built with posts that were stuck in the ground, and they were probably bent over and tied together at the, in the middle, or they may have even have been straight walls with like a gabled roof or something like that on top of it. It's hard to know what exactly the roof looked like since we only have the foundation. But inside of these, there often are bigger posts that were used to support the roof, so support posts. And then these weird little squiggly lines here are, there often are pits that go down into the floor, and it's inside these pits where people were buried. Sometimes people were laid out on platforms on the floor. So these buildings underneath the mounds were part crematorium, part funeral home, visitation place where people would attend what we would call a wake maybe. They might be part church and part gathering spot. They served a lot of functions, except they weren't places where people lived. Maybe if you were dead, you lived there, but the living lived elsewhere, not at the earthwork sites. Some of these buildings, the ones at Mound City, are pretty simple. They're just one room like that one. Some of them, though, are truly enormous. We call these great houses, which is a bit of a misnomer given what I just said, because the only people who live in a great house are dead people. But there's a really nice one down toward Portsmouth at a site called Tremper. This site, incidentally, was just purchased, kind of like Fortified Hill was, and is becoming another one of these preserves and a park you can go visit the mound at. But underneath the mound there at Tremper, maybe you can see all these little dots from where you're sitting. These are all little post holes outlining various rooms inside of this great house. Quite a few rooms in there. And if we zoomed in on this, you would see words that's like crematory, depository. In other words, there are a bunch of artifacts in that one. And over here is the phrase cache. There were something like about 100 stone pipes, smoking pipes here on the floor. And they were all carved, a lot of them were carved into the shapes of animals, on the bowl of the pipe. So pretty amazing cache. These are the ones that are on display at the Ohio History Connection. If you ever get a chance to go there again and see them in person, very cool stuff. So that's what's underneath the mounds. Hopewell mounds. Inside of these mounds, as I mentioned, or inside of these buildings, they did all kinds of interesting stuff. We don't know the half of it, undoubtedly, but we often find all of the really famous looking stuff in these mounds or under these mounds, like objects made of copper. And we've got a couple here from Mound City that's a cutout in the shape of a bird with some impressions in it. Here's another cutout. It's quite elaborate. It's about the size of a license plate. If you want to know how big this is. And then here's some of those pipes. These are actually the pipes from Mound City. There was another cache of pipes, almost exactly the same kinds of pipes. It was excavated in the 1800s and got carted off to what has become the British Museum. So if you want to see these, you have to go overseas. And then, of course, there are things made of mica, like this pretty famous one here from Hopewell Mound Group. So most of this really iconic Hopewell art has been found beneath the mounds with burials and other kinds of like display settings. Okay, so that's what happened at the earthworks. It's mostly things that involve dealing with the dead, partying with the dead. There are tons of ceremonies. There could have been sporting events and dancing, and it's obviously where people probably came to meet their spouses. Alliances were made there, so in times of need, you could call on the person, you met at the earthwork and say, hey man, can you spare, a couple baskets full of seeds because we're not doing so well over here in the Scioto Valley this year. So that's what the earthworks were all about. Now, people only spend a very limited amount of time at the earthwork sites, as far as we know. And day-to-day life happened out in settlements, very small settlements of maybe just 1 to 2 houses. So little clusters. We archaeologists call them hamlets because they're not villages. and I guess it would depend on how you define village, but I usually think of lots of houses in a village. And these Hopewell folks and Adina lived in very small settlements. So here's an example of one of these houses we excavated just south of Chillicothe. I'm flying around in a helicopter taking these pictures. You can see some people here walking around there. In the background are these little white dots. These are where the posts were of this house. So you can see it's a kind of a square-shaped house. The posts are about 3 feet apart, and they make a rather large building there, something like 40 feet across. There were 4 hearths in here, kind of symmetrically placed in the 4 quadrants. So we think there might have been multiple families living in there. It's not really a longhouse, but it is sort of like a longhouse turned into a square. So this house, this is one of the biggest ones we've ever found in Ohio, maybe had multiple family units in there. And it may have been people who were related, parents and children with their spouses, or brothers and sisters, something like that. Out in the yard around the house, we found tons of cooking pits and we call these earth ovens. So these are pits in the ground that were filled with rock that was heated up. So the rock was what provided the heat in the oven. So you'd put whatever you wanted to bake down in there, get the rock real hot, put it in there, cover it all up, and then come back later and dig it out. And you've got yourself a lot of cooked food. So this house in particular was surrounded on this side by tons of these earth ovens. There were also people buried in the yard, maybe 1 or 2 graves around this house. So this is what daily life was like. We found tons of just normal trash there, unremarkable cooking vessels and storage vessels, and lots of burned rock from cooking things, and plenty of charcoal, from kitchen fires and heating fires to keep the house warm. And we found lots of animal bone inside here, especially deer, from all different. When you harvest deer, as you may know, especially if you take young deer, you can kind of tell what time of the year it is when they've been killed by how mature they've become. And we found deer throughout kind of the maturation cycle. So from basically every time of the year you can imagine, we've got animals from various times, various seasons of the year. We got plants from various seasons of the year. So it sure looks like people were living at this place year round. So we think at least some of these hamlets were occupied all year round. But periodically people would leave and go hunting, or they'd go over to the earthwork site, participate in ceremonies and so on. And this is what we think that house looked like based on some engineering studies of the posts and their sizes and such. It was a very big thing, had a big central pole holding up the roof. So we think the roof was this shape. And it was probably covered with bark. Around this place, these folks were growing their own food. They did not have corn yet. So don't imagine that there are vast cornfields around these houses, but they were growing plants like this one called goosefoot. It's around today. It's probably growing in the sidewalk outside the building you're sitting in. It's a weed in most cases, but its near relative is quinoa. So this is, if you've eaten quinoa, you've basically eaten goosefoot, same stuff. And they were growing this in large quantities. It had been domesticated maybe hundreds, if not thousands of years before earthworks started to be built. So this wasn't new to Ohio. They're also growing maygrass, a seed-bearing plant that just doesn't naturally grow around here. And so it was brought in and tended. Sunflowers, and they were growing tobacco. This stuff is devilishly hard to find archaeologically because you can see that number there. It says 500 micrometers. So these seeds are like the size of a period at the end of a sentence. They're teeny weeny, very difficult to find, but we do find them periodically. And that could be some of what's being smoked in these platform pipes, tobacco. Okay, so those are the people and how they made a living, hunting and growing their food and gathering. They're dispersed across the landscape in these hamlets, and they get together at certain times of the year at earthworks, including a place like Fortified Hill. And that's where my doctoral research was in Hopewell Settlement, but my passion since graduating has become relocating these earthwork sites and helping to learn more about them and preserve them when possible. Apparently my dog doesn't like that. He's barking up a storm in the background. So this is what most Ohio earthworks look like. They are flat today, thanks to farming. I start my projects with maps usually, and there are lots of old maps in Ohio of these earthwork sites. This is Fort Ancient. We saw this map before. And there are 88 maps in this book published in 1848 called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And in fact, this is where the map of Fortified Hill was published. And we'll see that map here in a second. So a great book, easy to get online. It's been reprinted a zillion times. So if you're really keen on Ohio earthworks, you should get this book if you don't have it. I also use aerial photographs to image these earthwork sites, and there are quite a few of those around to look at. Some of the earliest are from the 1930s. A fellow named Dash Reeves flew around, and he was flying out of Dayton when he was taking pictures. So we have this image of the Newark earthworks, at least the octagon and observatory circle. Here's one in Ross County, pretty clear there, that oval in the middle. There's another one down there by Chillicothe. It's now part of a national park, a really large circle and square. So this circle is 1,000 feet across there. So quite large. There are lots and lots of teeny weeny ones too. This one's a tiny one we just found in an aerial photo a couple of years ago in Licking County. One of the earliest aerial photos that shows an earthwork in Ohio. And this is what it looks like today. It's been built on, unfortunately. That's where the earthwork should be. So we spend a lot of time tracking down old earthworks in essentially new places and seeing, what might be left of them. Another tool we have in our toolkit, and we're going to look at some data from Fortified Hill, this LiDAR data. Maybe you've heard of this recently. It's been in the news a lot in the last 5 years. They've been using it down in Central America to look, underneath the tree canopy in the jungle, and they're finding tons of amazing stuff that we didn't know was out there. It works in Ohio too, and in fact, the entire state has been flown with this LiDAR technology, and it's really just shooting a laser beam out of a plane toward the ground and using it to measure the distance from the plane. And what you get in the end is a 3D kind of arrangement of reflections from the laser, a point cloud. And we use that point cloud to make topographic maps. So here's a really famous place in Ohio. I'm sure most of you have been there, probably one of the most famous places in Ohio. And it's tricky to see from the air. So you never really can see it in aerial photographs very well, unless they're taken at exactly the right time of year. But we can see it very nicely in LiDAR data. So yeah, that's Serpent Mound, obviously. And one of the cool things about LiDAR is we can filter out all the trees. So there were trees there when the plane flew over this, but using the computer software, we can get rid of all that stuff. You can also get rid of houses and anything else that's sticking up above the ground. So here is the octagon and observatory circle at Newark. And as you may know, it's surrounded by houses and roads, and you can kind of see some of the roads there in the background. But we filtered out all the houses to just leave the embankments of the earthwork. It's really handy in Ohio because, in fact, there are parts of Ohio that still have trees growing on it. And there are some earthworks that have always had trees on them, so you never can see them from above. This is one that's by Springfield called the New Love Group. It's right there in the middle, not very photogenic. You can't see it. And even if we dial back time here in Google Earth, here we are in 2004, still can't see it. 1994, still can't see it. I've looked at lots and lots of photos going way back in time, and there's always trees on it. So that's kind of nice to know, though, because it means it's probably never been plowed. So if we look at the LiDAR data for here, we could say, yeah, look at that. It's super well preserved underneath those trees, and it's never been plowed. So we have two enclosures there, and you're looking at the embankments. and inside of them the ditches. So these are little rectangles or squares with rounded corners. I like to call them squircles because that has a nice ring to it, but technically they're super ellipses. Okay, another tool we use to look from above is drones. This is like the most fun part of my job is I have a drone flying license. We take these things up, take pictures of stuff, you know, below to create aerial photographs, but also to create topographic maps. So this is a mound site in Pickaway County called Snake Bend. And you can see the mound back there on the left. There it is from above. That mound we were just looking at is right there. And there are two more mounds hidden in the trees here, plus a little earthwork, a little enclosure here. And the whole thing is surrounded by a ditch and embankment that we only just discovered in 2007. But the problem is, with Snake Bend is it's always been hard to image this place because those trees have been there for a long time. So what I did one winter is we flew the drone around, took a bunch of photographs. Then we used the photographs to make a three-dimensional model with a process called photogrammetry. And then we took the photogrammetric model and I trimmed out all of the trees, leaving what you see here. So there should be a ton of trees right here, but I got rid of them. And now we can see the mounds really nicely. And all I've done here is I've added a light source and I'm just spinning it around here to at a low angle to show off different little humps and bumps in the landscape. So you can see that outer enclosure there. The ditch is very faint. And then up here in the plowed field, it's gone. It's been filled in. There's another mound over here. So yeah, this is some of the newest technology we have to help image earthworks in Ohio. Now, my favorite part, next to flying drones around, is this stuff. This is what I do for a living. I run these kinds of instruments, magnetometers and ground penetrating radar, and so on. And I spend a lot of time working in cemeteries. We've spent time overseas looking for World War II soldiers and all that fun stuff. But on the weekends, what I love to do is take this beast out and push it around cornfields. We did this, it seemed endlessly this last winter. This is in Indiana, actually. And we use this to locate hidden earthwork sites. So this one actually has 5 magnetometers on it. And then this doohickey up here at the top is a very fancy GPS system that's accurate to less than an inch. So it keeps track of where the machine is as I push it around the farm fields. And yes, we now tow this thing, thankfully, with an ATV. So let me show you an example of what this thing detects. So here is one of these maps from that book I was telling you about from 1848, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And you can see it's got lots of little shapes all over it. Those are earthworks. Chillicothe is just loaded with earthworks. And we're going to look more closely at that one there to the west of Chillicothe. It was shown on this map as just 2 circular enclosures. And this little smudge right here is a mound. All right. So this was what we got in the end after running the magnetometer out here a few years ago. And we did this across, I think, 13 or 14 Sundays. It was a weekend project. And we just drove down there each Sunday morning, got the magnetometer set up, ran it all day, and then went back home. And that's what we ended up with. So these are the 2 that were originally mapped. And all those other ones you see in there, hopefully you can see some. Those are all new ones that we didn't know about before. Let me zoom in on some here. Look at this little guy here more closely. So what we've detected, this dark stuff here, is a ditch that's been filled in with topsoil, probably because of plowing. So it's real flat here, but that ditch is still down there. It's still filled in with topsoil, and topsoil is just a little bit more magnetic than the clay subsoil around it. So the magnetometer can detect it. And at this site, it's done a darn good job. So out here in this thing, and maybe you're wondering, well, what's that crazy curvilinear thing there? That's an old stream channel. It's now high and dry, but this creek over here used to run through here, I'm sure, thousands of years ago. It doesn't now. And this little blob here, I've got this box drawn around, that's an island in the creek. And these folks built an earthwork right on top of it. A little tiny one. This thing is only about 30 feet across or so. So pretty small as earthworks go, but it's sitting right on that former island in that former stream channel. Don't think there was ever water in that stream channel, when these earthworks were built, but it's possible that they used that old stream channel as sort of part of the architecture of this site. I'm going to zoom in here on these weird linear things. These are where wire fences used to be back when this was an active farm. But maybe behind that, you'll see these shapes here. There's one of those super ellipses, and then next to it, there's a little square. So these are also ditches, trenches really dug into the ground, some kind of structures, enclosures of some sort, very small though. And finally, we're going to zoom in here. There's obviously a row of 3 enclosures here. These 2 are obvious. This one is kind of crescent shaped, kind of like the crescent moon. Here we have another super ellipse. And then this one here is hiding in all these blobs here. These are all the magnetic signatures of iron objects. So there used to be farm buildings in this area, and there was actually a milk shed or something right in the middle of this one, but you can still just make out the ditch that's still down there underground. Okay, maybe you noticed over here at the super ellipse, there's a circle that's kind of intersecting it. And if you look close, there actually are tons of circles in here. These are post circles. So they're, that sort of gives it away, right? They're circles of posts. So like think telephone pole sized posts set in the ground vertically. There probably was no wall or roof on these. They're a little bit too big to be roofed. They're usually about 45 to 60 or 70 feet across. So they're pretty good size. But these guys, the magnetometer did such a good job here. You can almost see the individual posts in there. And this one you can actually. So tons of these at this site. So these are the kinds of things we expect to find at earthwork sites. Ditch and embankment enclosures, post circles, and other kinds of features. We'll see some more examples of here in a minute. So just to kind of bring it home for you, where once we only knew of 2 enclosures, we ended up with 12 ditch and embankment enclosures, 9 post circles, and 3 of these little ditch trench things. So every site I go to survey at, just about, produces some kind of cool new thing that we didn't know was there before. And when we start excavating at these sites, testing these things to see what they are, we often find that they're really just the tip of the iceberg for what's actually down there. The magnetometer can't actually detect everything. But in this case, it's sure to detect a lot. So it's a lot of fun for me because I don't want to say it's like looking for treasure, but for me, this is treasure, finding these old earthwork sites and kind of bringing them back to life in essence, rediscovering them and getting them preserved. It's my passion. Okay. How you guys doing? You still awake back there? You're just a wee little picture on my screen. I see you in there. Nobody's slumped over just yet. I want to show you now an example of what Fortified Hill could become, potentially, with enough research. So this is the Fort Ancient site. You probably visited there or heard about it. These little squiggly lines here are the embankment walls. Some of them are 20 feet tall. They're quite big. Then these little dark squiggly things inside the walls are little depressions that fill with water. Some folks call these borrow pits, places where the soil was dug up to build the embankments, but in reality, quite a few of these, if not all of them, were made on purpose to be water holding features. So not only were these folks building earthen embankments and building things out of wood, they were also digging holes in the ground and with the intent of the holes holding water. So earth, wood, stone, water, they used all kinds of materials in building these places. So you might think the water thing is weird, but heck, some of you may have a fish pond in your backyard or other kinds of water features in your yard, bird bath, whatever. We still build water features. So this is not super unusual for people all around the world. Here's a close-up of what's called the North Fort. And if you've driven through here, you've driven on this road here. This is an old road, dates to something like 1806 or 07. And this is the road, and after a little bit after that. But you've got those two big mounds there on the one side of the enclosure, and the road actually goes over a little crescent-shaped embankment. But what I wanted to talk to you about is something we found right in here. And the reason that's important is because this is the kind of thing that we may find at Fortified Hill. But before I talk about that, I should talk about this slide. These hilltop enclosures often have stone pavements associated with them, and Fort Ancient has tons of these road-like stone pavements that are all over the place inside there. This was one excavated in the early 1900s. How they found it, I think they were just trenching around and they started to uncover some stones, so they followed it. They did that all over the place inside the earthwork and found lots of them. In 2005, I got hired to do what I do for a living, the geophysical survey stuff, ahead of some work they were going to do to fix erosion happening to the embankment walls. And to get to the embankment walls, they had to drive across the site. So they didn't want to damage anything that might be there with the vehicles. So they had me go in there first and look for stuff. And this area here, area D, got so big because we kept finding stuff. Eventually, they abandoned that part of the project to go fix that thing back here because there was just too much in the way. Too much that was really cool. So here's a photograph from the 1930s, and the thing we're interested in is right in here. It never shows up in any aerial photos, and it's never been on any maps. So here are all the features we know about there at Fort Ancient. And this is where I did my first line of magnetic survey. It's about 60 feet wide and pretty long there. And it ran from the road back to the embankment wall. And here's what I found. So the black and white stuff there is the magnetic data, and we're just looking at a little sliver of it. And on the first day, we hit that thing right there. Can you see that? It's a kind of a black blob with white around it. That thing is, how big is that? It's about 12 feet across, so it's pretty good size. And at first I thought it might be the cellar, like for a cabin, an old cabin site that we didn't know was there. But I stuck a soil corer into it. So I punched a metal tube down into the soil and pulled it out with some dirt, and it was bright. I mean, it was red orange. Looked like the ground had been burned really hot on that spot. And I thought, aha, I think we've found something important and something that's probably Hopewell, because the Hopewell were pyromaniacs. They burned all kinds of stuff. So we extended the surveys to try to figure out what that thing was, and that's what we ended up with in the end. And I'll cut to the chase there. It's that thing right there, kind of a circular thing, some kind of enclosure. We didn't know what it was at the time. I thought it might be one of these ditch and embankment enclosures. And right in the middle of it is this big area of burned soil. Kind of looks like a cyclops. All right, so here's a closer up view of that. And I thought we had maybe two of these enclosure things. There's one there and one outside of it there. We have what I thought was an entrance here to the south. And then and this sort of looks like the Great Circle at Newark. This is a kind of a shrunken version of it, but it has that same kind of circle with these outturned, this outturned kind of entranceway there. And then in the middle, we've got the big burned thing. Okay, so that's just me thinking, right? This is just magnetic data. I don't actually know what the heck is down there underground. I'm guessing at this point, in an educated way, but guessing. So we ran an electrical resistance meter out there as well. That just shoots some electrical current in the ground and measures how well it flows. And it found this slightly different soil here. We call it in place soil. So dirt brought from somewhere else and laid in here for some landscape modification. In that in place soil, you can see those curving enclosure things. So they are related to this stuff. And then I've pointed out two little blobs there. They're very faint in this yellow and black color, but if we change the color scheme a little bit, you can see this one especially. It's very distinctive, and it has that shape. Remember that term, super ellipse, so a rectangle with rounded corners. And that's often the shape of these buildings, Hopewell buildings. So I thought maybe these were the floors of buildings. There's my interpretive map. It doesn't look like much, but it's some sort of oval enclosure, big red thing in the middle, a couple of building floors there. So that's when Wright State took over the next year. They started doing an archaeological field school there. And they worked on that excavation for, gosh, I think it was 15 years or something like that. It was a long time. And they found all kinds of amazing stuff. And what's ironic is it's not more than like 100 steps from the museum. It was just hiding there in plain sight, this thing was. And they started in Block A, which is located right here. The first question was, what is this enclosure? What's it made of? Is it a ditch and embankment, or is it something else? And what you're seeing here is the aftermath of the excavation. And what they found were 2 lines of very large post holes. So these were holes that posts were stuck in. And with this excavation, what they discovered was that this enclosure is a very large post circle. And these things are often called wood henges. Maybe you've heard that term before. I know wood henge is something that we see over in England, but we've borrowed the term and we use it here. So the enclosure is also now called the Moorhead Circle, and it's a wood henge. It's actually not one wood henge. It's several wood henges built on top of one another in the same spot. So these outer posts are kind of cool. They're set in trenches. This is the bottom of the trench there. And the post was at one side to the inside of the circle. And then to the outside in the trench, they threw a bunch of rock in there to hold the post up, because this ground is kind of, it's wet a lot of the year, so it's really squishy. If they hadn't put the rock in there, the post probably would have just fallen over. So whoever built this thing knew a lot about their site. They knew it was marshy, good part of the year. They knew they would need rock to help stabilize big things sticking up out of the ground like posts. So they were smart folks. And they had to go down to the river to get this stuff, which is like a 200-foot climb, down the slope, down, maybe more than 200 feet to get the rock. So there's a lot of work, not only to cut the trees to put in these trenches, but you had to bring all that rock too. And we're talking, I think it's like a couple hundred trees to make this post circle. Imagine how many pounds of rock that would be. It's a lot of rock. All right, so we had an outer line of these posts, and then an inner line too. And it turned out they found yet another one too. So there were 3 circles of posts here. Not sure if they were all standing at once. They may represent different time periods, So this place may have been used and then refreshed a couple of times, maybe 3 generations worth. So that was over here, Trench A. They did an excavation in the middle they called Block B. And sure enough, that turned out to be a great big area of this orangish soil. It's about 12 feet across. If we zoom in on it, I haven't adjusted the color here at all. Not sure what color you're seeing there, but it should look like hunter orange. It's very orange and very burned, which is why it's so magnetic. There's nothing in it, so it's not the most exciting stuff to excavate. But on top of it, all the way around the circumference of this circular patch of orange soil, there were artifacts on top of it. And here you can see a bunch of broken pottery sherds that were excavated. They found bits of mica, some animal bones. There was one worked shell bead, I think, a number of things. And all of this stuff was Hopewell artifacts, probably dating to around AD, I think it was 200 to 300, in that range. Over here on the left, they tested the outer enclosure again in Block C. And this one was really interesting. They found rocks scattered around, and often these rocks were coming up out of post holes where they were used to hold big posts in place. But they also found these strange things. Can you see those in the photo? Those slightly lighter colored soil there that's arcing along. across the excavation. They seem to parallel one another, and they're kind of following the curvature of the wood henge. When they excavated one or two of them, they found that they were a trench that was dug into the ground, and then it was filled in with kind of gravelly, sandy material. So it was much different than the clayey subsoil around it. We've never seen anything like this before at a Hopewell site. So we didn't know what it was. Here's what one looks like in profile. It doesn't look like much, but there's the bottom of it. This one's got some charcoal in it down there. But it was dug down into the clayey subsoil. All right, and you can see this is a meter stick. That's really far down there. That's a couple feet down underground to get to the top of this thing. And then the bottom is almost, just over 3 feet down. Okay, so here's my enclosure based on the magnetic data. There's the big burn thing in the middle. There's the entrance to this enclosure. And here's the excavation block that found these linear things. There were 7 of them in this trench. And you'll notice the magnetometer did not detect them. the magnetometer can't detect everything, unfortunately. So we took the ground penetrating radar out there and gave it a try next to the excavation to see if maybe we could detect these things. So what I'm going to do, so the radar is a bit like a CAT scan. You create a 3-dimensional block of data, and then you can slice it at different depths. And so I'm showing you the view from above here. I mean, we're going to slice this radar data and go deeper and deeper into the ground. So right now we're at about I don't know, 6 or 7 inches into the ground, and here we are about a foot into the ground. Not much interesting there yet. The red stuff is strong reflections. Blue stuff, not much going on. And now, as we get deeper, we begin to see these linear things showing up. And when we get way down here at like 2 feet down, we're like, oh, look at that. Now there are linear things that kind of seem to match up with what's in the excavation unit. And sure enough, the whole area was filled with these linear things. So we came back on another trip and did the entire place with the radar, about an acre or so. And here are a couple slices from that. So this is where the big burned thing is in the middle. And then the entrance to the enclosure is up here at the top of the screen. So here we are, real shallow, getting a little bit deeper. And what we're seeing is, I don't know what this stuff is, it's mowing patterns or something. But this crazy spaghetti down here at the bottom, it turns out the radar is really good at detecting tree roots. So if you happen to need to find some tree roots, let me know, I can help you out. So we've got a big oak tree down here that's got roots going on forever. But once we get below those, and they start to disappear, and these linear things start to show up. And they only seem to occur in between the big burn thing in the middle. And hey, look, there's something here at the entranceway too, some strong reflections. So it looks like maybe there's something going on at the entrance, just inside of it. There are all these weird curvilinear things inside the entrance, and then nothing going on in this half of the enclosure. We don't actually know what these things are, these curvilinear things, but we think they could be drainage features, because if you remember, I said earlier that this site gets real kind of wet in the winter. The water just lays in the soil, and when you jump up and down it, you can feel someone jumping like 10 or 20 feet away from you. It's so boggy in there. So these things may have been essentially French drains to help drain that water out of the enclosure to dry it up. So I'm going to show you now a picture of what this stuff is. Wright State University excavated this. I thought that it might be one of these stone pavements. They should create really strong radar reflections. And sure enough, here they are uncovering not just 1, but 2 layers of stone pavement right at the entrance to the enclosure. So in my mind, this is probably about as close to looking like, an excavation in Italy, Roman road or something, as we're going to get in Ohio. This was made, about 1800 years ago, this pavement. What it really is, though, is it's not a mud mat, but it's a way to keep an area of high traffic, the entrance, from turning into a mud pit. So it's kind of like a welcome mat coming into this enclosure. Over next to the burned area, they also found the floor that I was talking about of that kind of super ellipse shaped structure. And the floor was embedded with all kinds of burned soil and charcoal and burned bone. The floor was refreshed many times, like 10 or 12 times over the years. New sand brought in to make the floor, and then they used it, and a bunch of junk got on it. And then, you know, maybe the next year they brought in more sand and remade the floor. So this platform was refreshed numerous times. There's close-up of it. So the orange color in there is burning. So they were burning fires on them. Then they brought in a layer of fresh fill to remake the floor. And then they did it again, did more things. So a very popular spot inside the Woodhenge. And then finally, just kind of sprinkled all over the place are these massive holes in the ground for very big posts. So maybe you can tell this is a circle of stones. Well, that circle goes all the way around. And inside of it, in this dark soil, there would have been a great big post stuck in the ground. I don't know that these were like totem poles, but since they're freestanding posts, they don't seem to be part of structures that we know of. There must be something like that going on here. I wish we had one of these posts to look at, but we have yet to find a really big modified post with carvings or painting or anything like that on it. Just doesn't preserve so well in Ohio, unfortunately. So what we see at these places is the earthen architecture. We see the stone stuff. Sometimes we see burned wood. And what we're missing is all of the wood architecture, which must have been pretty amazing. There is the Morehead Circle drawn to scale inside Fort Ancient. So it looks pretty small, even though it's a couple hundred feet across. It looks pretty small compared to this hilltop enclosure. Speaking of hilltop enclosures, finally, the moment you've been waiting for, your very own hilltop enclosure in your backyard, basically, Fortified Hill. So how did it get that name? Well, I mean, it was published with that name. This fellow here, James McBride, I don't know if you see that name there. He surveyed and made this map in the 1830s, and this is really the only map of the site. When I first saw this map, probably 25 years ago, I thought, I wonder how good of a job he did way back in 1836 in making this map, because it looks bizarre, especially with these crazy nested embankments there at this entrance. He also made this map. These two things were published in that book in 1848. So this is a 6-mile stretch of the Great Miami River. Fortified Hill is right up there. So if you know where Fortified Hill is, you probably have a sense of where this is. The red area there is where Hamilton is. So this is kind of across the river from Hamilton, up on one of those hills on the other side of the river. I think there's a road, I think it's 128, that sort of follows along the west side of the river. So the earthwork would be up the hill from 128, not far from Smith Road, if that sounds familiar to you. All right, so there it is, Fortified Hill. And what does it consist of? Well, when McBride mapped it, he mapped an outer embankment wall that kind of surrounds this hilltop. It covers about, I think it's 16 acres or so. So remember I said Fort Ancient was 100 acres. And the very largest hilltop enclosure we know about in Ross County is something like 140 acres. So, you know, Fortified Hill is not the smallest, but it's nowhere close to being the biggest. It's kind of right there in the middle. One of these sort of mid-sized hilltop enclosures. It has, at least in maps, some of the most elaborate gateways of any enclosure in Ohio. So that's really what Fortified Hill is known for, is these very elaborate gateways. And they're built out of embankments of soil. So that's the lines we see here on McBride's map. And then maybe you notice there are little blobs here kind of in between some of the embankments. These are depressions in the ground that McBride called dug holes. All right, keep that in mind. There are two more very elaborate gateways down here at the bottom. There's the East Gateway, that's what this one's called, and the South Gateway right there. And hey, they also have little dug holes in them. I'm going to zoom in on those two gateways. So here's the south one. There's the east one. You'll notice the east one has a couple of holes in it. South one has one big one. These are water features. Remember, we talked about those at the Fort Ancient site. They're purposefully built depressions that hold water. And these work really good at Fortified Hill. They're still there, and they still hold water for a good part of the year. They're great for salamanders and frogs, who I'm sure have a ball messing around in the water. But you can see where you would, if you were outside, you would enter the enclosure here. You'd have to kind of wind your way past the water and then go through this bend in the embankments, and then you come out right there into the interior of the enclosure. Same thing happens here in the South Gateway, but it's the mirror image. Can you see that there? They look very similar, but they're mirror images of one another. So when I saw this, I was like, I don't trust that. That just doesn't look real. I think maybe McBride was dreaming when he drew this map, because that happened in the 1800s. There are lots of maps drawn of Ohio earthworks, and some of them are terrible, and some of them are quite accurate, actually. So I've always wondered, which one is this? Is it accurate, or is it a little bit fiction? In addition to the embankments and these really cool gateways, Fortified Hill has mounds as well. And since this enclosure is probably Hopewell in age, so I'd guess just off the top of my head, if it's Hopewell, it's probably somewhere between AD 200 and AD 400, because that's when all this hilltop enclosure stuff was happening in Ohio. So it's about 1600 to 1800 years old. If that's when this mound dates to, that means that the mound probably covers the foundations of a building. This mound was dug into a bit in the 1800s by kids, I think, and they did find some skeletal material. It's kind of hard to tell where in the mound that is, because in the 1800s, kids digging in mounds didn't take lots of notes about what they were finding, or pictures, or draw any maps. So we just have sort of second, third, fourth hand information about this. There's another mound at the site. It's just a wee little blip on McBride's map. It's down here. It's actually, this mound is bigger actually than this one up here. It just wasn't quite as tall. It's called the Werner Mound. It's kind of an oblong mound. It's out in the woods, still there. It too was tested in the 1800s, the late 1800s, and some skeletal material was found in or under that as well. So these are, you could call them burial mounds if you'd like, but mounds aren't the only places where burials occur at hilltop enclosures. Sometimes they're found inside the enclosure. Sometimes they're on these little bits of flat ground that are outside the enclosure. We just don't know where they are here at Fortified Hill, but you can bet there are plenty there, I'm sure. Let's see. There are also these stone mounds at the site. These are now gone. There's no stone left, and I suspect that the stone was borrowed to be used in building barn and house foundations, in the 1800s. And that's true of a lot of hilltop enclosures. Stone was used in making the embankments, and oftentimes it got robbed away to build buildings in the 1800s. Okay, so this is what it looks like today. Isn't it amazing? This is 128 over here. This is the Great Miami River. These are some baseball diamonds on the other side of the river. So I don't know if that helps orient you to where exactly this is. Smith Road is just off the map here, back above the image. So we're up on the kind of the crest of the hill overlooking Hamilton. I've got a bunch more pictures here, so we'll maybe get a better sense of where this is. If you know your roads, this is Sky Meadow Drive, right there. The end of it is right there. Okay, so that's where the earthwork is up here on this aerial photograph. This is an image from Google Earth. So if you are a Google Earth user, or maybe even you could open your smartphone and have a look. you might see this image. What you won't see is where the earthwork is, because I added those lines there. So that's where it is. We can't see it in aerial photographs. So of course, since it doesn't show up so well in photos, I went to LiDAR data to see if I couldn't spot it. And in the first batch of LiDAR data was flown in Ohio in about 2006. And it was amazing for looking for earthwork sites, but it's pretty low density. We only have a topographic data point, like 1 every 5 or 6 feet. And in areas where there are trees, and if you didn't notice, there are a lot of trees at Fortified Hill, the data is even worse. So it's a little bit tricky, especially over here, to see the earthwork. But if you look closely, you can see that kind of weird shape right there where those red arrows are. And it pretty much matches the drawing from the 1830s. It's just not quite good enough, though, to know how good of a job McBride did in the 1830s. But this is the map that we used to get people excited a couple of years ago to raise money to help buy Fortified Hill. So you may recall there was a fundraising campaign, and some of you probably donated to it. We were all giving our money to the Archaeological Conservancy, which is a national level organization that helps save archaeology sites. And they were going to pool our money along with some of their money, and they were going to hand that money over to the Harry T. Wilkes Foundation and Pyramid Hill to help make the purchase. Well, as you maybe heard, the Harry T. Wilkes Foundation just said, meh, we don't need your money, and they just bought it themselves. So you may have gotten your money back, or you told the Archaeological Conservancy that they could keep your donation. I mean, that's what I did. So the Harry T. Wilkes Foundation, a nonprofit group, it's like a foundation. So it was set up with a huge chunk of cash, and then the foundation grows, based on money earned by that initial setup money. And then they give money away and do things with it. They help fund Pyramid Hill and so on. And they used a good amount of their cash to buy the property that contains Fortified Hill. And then they essentially donated it to Pyramid Hill. And so Pyramid Hill Sculpture Park, they own Fortified Hill now. Okay, so lucky for us, in 2017, a new batch of LiDAR data was flown, and it's much higher resolution. And so now we can actually see the earthworks. Can you see it there? I'm going to zoom in on it a bit. So here it is, close up. And this flat, smooth looking area, that's the part of the field that's in grass. If you remember from the aerial photo, it's not a very big area. And then this sort of bumpy area, that's where the trees are. And the little bumps are actually where the trees have been cut off when the data were filtered to get rid of the trees. So we can still see the stumps of the trees essentially. And in there, we can very clearly make out the shape of the enclosure at Fortified Hill. Unfortunately, since it's built on a hill and the embankments are down over the edge of the slope, they never quite all show up at once in a map like this, where I just have one light source. In this case, imagine it's the sun setting over on the western horizon there to the upper left. And it's just super bright over there. So it makes it hard to see the embankments there, but it makes it easy to see the embankments over here. So there are ways to trick it, fancy ways, by adding light from all directions, which is what we've got here. And I put the light source low on the horizon. And now we can see that the embankment casts a shadow all the way around. Kind of looks like the landscape is made of metal too, which is a little weird, but the earthwork shows up pretty nicely, as do all of the property lines. So this is a fence line here in the woods. Here's another fence line that's in the woods. There's still fences on these things too. So this is why they show up so well in the LiDAR data. But I think you can see the embankment really nicely there. This is the North Gateway. We don't see those strange arcing embankments there making up that elaborate gateway, but they're there. They're just really flat. They've been plowed down, for the last 200 years or so. This doesn't get plowed anymore, but enough plowing happened that it's basically flattened them. And then I noticed in these data that the gateways down here, the east one and the south one, those show up pretty well too. And I wondered if there was a way to make them look even better. And I found this technique called a local relief model. So what we do is we process the data a bit to get rid of the hill and make the whole thing flat. And so everything is on the same plane, and then it all shows up at the same time. So here's a local relief model. It looks like lightning or something, you know, going across the page, but there's the earthwork there, that black line. We're going to zoom in on it there. And what we see is that, man, the earthwork actually is there and it goes all the way around. And it's almost like making, you know, going out there with a surveying instrument, making a map of this. We can see it very clearly. We can see these crazy gateways here in the south. There's the north gateway, shows up quite well. And when we compare it to McBride's map from 1836, it's like, hey, kudos to James McBride. He did a really good job in mapping that place. And all he had was a surveyor's compass and chains. And he was pretty darn good at using them because he made a really nice map. It matches quite well. And more interestingly, if you can see these from where you're sitting, see if I don't zoom in on them, but the eastern gateway and the southern gateway look exactly like what McBride mapped in the 1830s. So those were not fiction. They weren't a figment of his imagination. That's what they look like. And we have them here in the LiDAR data pretty clearly. They're pretty hard to see when you walk out there and look at them because they're just big enough and there's trees and brush and stuff that you can't see all of them at once. Yeah, they are there. I'm going to end with what's going on now and where we're going with all this. So the property's been purchased, and now the plan is to open it up to the public and have some trails in there so that you can walk back to the site from Sky Meadow Road and go see some of these things. Even though they're kind of low to the ground, we're hoping to help people be able to visualize them. And we're going to provide some interpretive signs. So when I say we, I mean there's a group of us who are working with Pyramid Hill to help design this interpretive experience with trails and some interpretive signs. We'll probably have 5 or 6 signs in there. There'll be a kiosk up by the road, and ultimately, hopefully, there'll be something in the museum there at Pyramid Hill too, a display. And we're hoping to have like a cool 3D, model of it in the museum. In theory, this is all supposed to open to the public in March of next year, but we'll see if we make that deadline. We're working hard. And so here's what we're doing. First, we needed to clear the way for this trail. The trail will probably cause more erosion to happen. People walking on it will cause compaction, blah, blah, blah. So we wanted to see if there was any archaeology where the trail is. And so I took the magnetometer out there. We spent a couple of days running it around. It's not a very big area. So we did the whole mode area, kind of where the trail is going to go in 2 days. And here's the first day's results. So this black and white stuff is the magnetic data. And then over here on the right is a blow up of that. And, we didn't find a wood henge, unfortunately, at least that I noticed in the magnetic data, but we did find a number of possible cooking pits. They may date to a different time period than the earthwork. They might be a lot older. And then we found these really kind of weird looking areas in the magnetic data on the highest part of the hill inside the enclosure. And I suspect these could be archaeology. We're going to have to do some excavations and maybe run the radar off it to figure out what these guys are, but they're rather large, whatever they are. So that's kind of interesting. There's something there. Could be a mound, the remains of mounds or something in there, or prepared surfaces like what we saw inside the Moorhead Circle at Fort Ancient. As we moved north towards Sky Meadow, you can see we filled in this whole field up here around the North Mound. And that was a hard day. It's very slopey in there. So I was pushing that cart. I got quite tired trying to do it. What we found in there was basically nothing. we found historic era stuff. There used to be a cabin in the woods here. So there's maybe a gravel drive that went back to it. There's an old fence line there coming off this barn lot. There's some power lines in here. And then over here by Sky Meadow, we found lots and lots of iron objects, probably related to this farm, from the 1800s. So we did find stuff inside the enclosure, but not much outside of it. No huge surprise there. And finally, what we've been doing recently, and maybe you've heard about this, and maybe some of you have helped, and you certainly can help. We've got lots more of it to do, is we've been clearing brush to get ready to build the paths, the trails that are going to go through the site. So here we are by the North Mound, cutting back the honeysuckle. There is a very healthy crop of honeysuckle out there. It's very fast growing, and it's kind of choked out the North Mound. So there's the mound there, and you can barely see it, even here after we've cleared the honeysuckle off of it. Here's an aerial view after we pulled all the honeysuckle off and set it aside, and you can kind of see in there now, and the mound is right there. So the path we're planning will come right along here where this vehicle track is. It'll come by the mound. There'll be an interpretive sign here, and then you'll turn and head out to the earthwork this way. So we did that last, when did we start that? In the fall, obviously, because there's no leaves on there. And then we came back and did it again after the snow melted. We've also been working here at the North Gate. Here's an aerial view of that. So we're looking east. The Great Miami is down here. Hamilton would be off here to your left. And this is the North Gateway right here. And this was all covered in honeysuckle, and we've cleared it all out of here off the embankment. So now as a visitor, you can walk the path, which will come right through here, and you'll be able to walk right through that gateway like they did 1,800 years ago. And you'll be able to see the embankment wall here and off to the left. We're going to clear it back this way. And this is where we could use some help, actually, with what's next. Is we need help clearing. We usually get from 5 to 15 people out there to help. And last time we did it, we had 5 people, and I was the youngest one, and I'm almost 50. So a lot of folks were 65 and older. So we can only do so much during a day, but more hands make this job much faster. So if you're interested, keep an eye on Pyramid Hill, their website, or their social media. They post when we're going to do this. And you can let them know, or just show up at their visitor center on the day we're going to do this, and you can be part of the crew. We probably will have one more session this summer, maybe 2, and we're going to finish up work here at the North Gateway by clearing back some of this stuff, and then we're going to go down here and dive into the woods to try to go down to the East Gateway and create that path. What's really cool is the Pyramid Hill folks want to build a platform back there that you can walk up some stairs and stand on and look down on the East Gateway, which should be really cool if we do it right. It's basically the only way you can see it, because it's a little too big to see if you're standing on the ground. So we'll be needing some help with that as well. Ooh, okay. I almost made it within an hour, but you guys have any questions about all this? You've got a pretty cool site in your backyard, and we just don't know enough about it yet to fill in all the gaps, which is actually kind of exciting. We are creating the story of this place, or recreating it, rediscovering it as we speak almost.
Could you, with your pointer in that photograph there, point where the mounds are approximately to your east and the west?
Yeah, okay, so there's, this is a tricky image. Let me just back up. So what you were just looking at, the drone was right here, and it was looking this way, right? And so the North Mound is up here. This is the North Mound. So we're looking north at the North Mound. The enclosure is behind the drone here. And Sky Meadow is over here to the right. So now the drone is hovering, and the North Mound is behind us because we're looking south, I guess. And The north gateway is here. The enclosure is right here in this space. And then that other mound is way over here in the woods. We're going to eventually build a trail to that too, but it's a bit farther away. It's like the farthest place to walk to from Sky Meadow. And ultimately, we'd love to create a trail that follows the entire circumference, entire outline of the enclosure. But that's going to take a lot of clearing to do that. It's very dense in here. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of ticks found during that project. Yeah.
Was the climate approximately the same as we have here now?
That's a good question. Yeah, probably so. The most distinctive climate changes that we know about in Ohio's past, when Native Americans were living here, was somewhere around 5000 BC. That's about when the climate settled down and became much like it is today. So, and maybe not surprisingly, that's also when people started to settle down. And, about a couple thousand years after that, they started making pottery and they started domesticating plants. And it wasn't long before they started building enormous burial mounds like the Adena mounds and all that. So yeah, it's very much like it is today, except, as you probably know, there were a lot more trees and they were way, way bigger. So you probably know this too, that there really isn't much to eat under a mature forest. It's kind of dark and there's nothing really growing on the ground, and the trees just block out the sun so much that you have to go to the edges of the forest in order to find lots and lots of food resources, at the level where people can access them and deer can access them. So people were probably tending the forest back then, killing trees by girdling them to open up the canopy and let some light down there so that the kinds of food that deer like will grow and people like will grow. So that was all, I'm sure, part of their tending of the landscape. I remember they were growing plants too back then, so they needed sunlight to get to the ground in order to grow the plants. So I know that there were pockets of prairie in Ohio, but there weren't that many pockets of prairie. So the people were making their own pockets, of open ground by tending the trees. So it's a little hard to imagine, but maybe if you pop over to Houston Woods, in the middle of summer, you can have a look at what one of these forests might have looked like in that part of Ohio. Unfortunately, all the forests in the Scioto Valley have been cut many times, and we're looking at, regrowth, not nearly as big as they used to be. And of course, we're missing tons of trees too, right? There's no chestnut, no elm, two of the major species that made up forests in Ohio are now gone.
So what kind of clearing are you doing? Like just hand clearing with chainsaws, using equipment?
Yes, to the chainsaws. So we usually have 2 or 3 chainsaws on site cutting away at the honeysuckle, and then we have people dragging the honeysuckle out and piling it up. And then we're going to bring in chippers, shredders, and put the debris into those and chop it all up mechanically. So people bring hand saws and loppers, but if the chainsaws are doing their job, then mostly what everybody else is doing is just dragging branches around and piling them up. Yeah. So we did all this here in 2 days. One day we just had was it 2 days? 3 days. No, 2.5 days. 1.5 days we had just 4 or 5 people, and then another day we had a bumper crop. We had a dozen people out there, and we got almost the whole thing done on that day. So of course now it's kind of hot, so we don't work so hard when it's hot. We take lots of breaks, but if we had a lot of people, we could get a lot done.
All right, so do you have any problem with high schoolers that are looking for NHS hours?
No. I think all we would need is people to kind of coordinate them.
Okay.
They would probably need to be doing their service hours while we're all there, so when the group is there. But if you happen to be able to arrange a small group of them, we could probably have a special event for them, special clearing event, and put them to work. We were thinking about getting Boy Scouts too, if you know of any Boy Scout troops who need something to do. It's not the most fun thing, but what's kind of neat is you see the earthwork emerge from the brush, as you're doing it. And so, at least for me, a real sense of accomplishment each day when you go out there and clear that stuff away, because it's sort of fun to think about how we are seeing this for the first time in many years, be uncovered. The folks who used to own this property, they saw it all the time, but not many people have been out here, over the last 1,300 years or more. And so we are making this into a park, which is sort of a strange thing to think about. That's not what I do normally, make parks, but that's what we're doing. We're making a park for the public to come visit.
Will there ever be a dig on there at all?
Yeah, I'm sure. So digs take people to run digs. And so usually we try to locate university professors, archaeologists who are interested in running the dig. But maybe we could talk Pyramid Hill into some other kind of arrangement. I mean, I run digs too, but I don't do so many on earthwork sites, only because it's a ton of work. But there are some real discrete features out there in the magnetic data that I showed you guys, like those pit features. They are right in here. There's some right in here, and then there's a couple more right in here. We could test some of those. Those would be an easy little project that we could get some people involved in, like you guys or whomever. And then there's those other things that are back here on the top of the hill. Those are going to need some testing too, so maybe we could do some of that. You think you guys would be interested in participating in something like that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. What time of year would be the best? I kind of like winter, because right now it would be awful, super hot.
After the cicadas, anytime after the cicadas.
Yeah. So I'm thinking like fall or late winter. When what I found is the best temperature is about 30 degrees, maybe 40. If you're working, I mean, you will be plenty warm at that temperature. Just dress appropriately.
For sure.
The problem,
yeah, be mixed in with that. I mean, is it a Hopewell site for sure? Or maybe the whole works right now. I mean,
can you talk a little bit louder? I can't hear what you're saying.
Hopewell culture, or is it the Adena culture? I mean, is it...
Oh, this thing, yeah, it's Hopewell.
Sure.
So the Adena didn't really build hilltop enclosures that we know of. They may have built mounds that have been incorporated into hilltop enclosures later. So for instance, there's a hilltop enclosure in Perry County. I'm not too far from Buckeye Lake, if you know where that is. And it's called Glenford Fort. You can Google that thing. Really cool hilltop enclosure with a stone embankment wall all the way around it. And inside of it, there's a really big stone Adena mound. It was excavated in the 1980s, and some radiocarbon dates were run, and they were definitely Adena dates. So that's a case where Hopewell Hilltop Enclosure was built around an Adena mound. Happened a lot. So we don't know of any Adena features here just yet, but there could be. What you wouldn't expect to find a lot of at this site is artifacts. And I think that surprises people, because they think, oh, it's this great big earthwork, and that's where all of the treasures in Ohio have been found. And it's like, well, yeah, at certain sites, but that's a select few really enormous, amazing sites like Hopewell Mound Group and Mound City and Sipe and Tremper and Fort Ancient. This site doesn't have as many mounds and probably won't have as many artifacts. And we're not going to dig in any mounds. Because we just don't dig up burials anymore. That was something done in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. and we've stopped doing that. So the kinds of things we'll be looking for are the wooden architecture, you know, the post circles, and we'll be trying to see if there's anything back here to do with these big magnetic features. Maybe they're prepared surfaces or something like that. I'm hoping they're not where the cows were fed and they just tramped the ground a million times, but we could discover that too. This used to be pasture, so you never know. But the more you dig at any site in Ohio, the more you find, obviously. So as we start doing work out here, we will find stuff, undoubtedly. We're not just going to randomly dig. We're going to dig in places where the magnetometer and other instruments have found things. So we'll be testing those things.
When the site was repurchased, some of the stories came out that it was parceled up. Did they get all of it, or 85% of it? Or?
That's a good question. So I don't have the property boundaries on here, but what they purchased was basically from Sky Meadow Road here over to here, and then out into here, big area out here. And then it comes down to here and it cuts over like this, and it cuts down like that. So they got everything except this little stretch of wall right here. This part was not for sale. So they couldn't buy it, but they got everything else. Which I should add is a bit of a miracle, because when we took those folks on a little tour out there, I mean, you can't really see this thing, you know, unless you know what you're looking for. So they had to sort of take our word for it that there was something cool there, worth spending $1.5 million on. And I guess we were convincing. Maybe I should go into sales.
I think so. Does anyone else have any questions?
I got something maybe not related to that. Back in the 70s, down on the Ohio River, there's a power plant called Miami Fort, and he uncovered, when they get ready to put one of the big fires in, he uncovered a burial site of Indian, and they were supposed to be like 5,000 years old back that time. I don't know anything about it. You look a little too young for that.
Well, I was a kid in the 70s, and I also lived in Illinois, so I wouldn't have been involved in that. But Miami Fort is, as you guys know, a famous spot on Shawnee Lookout. And there were some excavations in the mound there, I believe, and other excavations around that site. And yeah, there was a power plant built not too far away, right? I don't know all the details about it, but there was a bit of Hopewell stuff found up there. I'm not familiar with the burials that were 5,000 years old, but that would all predate the Adena. It would be archaic in age, middle archaic, well, middle to late archaic. So that would be before mound building in Ohio. There's a lot of that stuff kind of all over the place, especially late archaic stuff everywhere. And those are the ones who kind of started the whole distinctive burial practices. They were burying their dead in bumps made by glaciers, like glacial cames. You know, so the glacial came Indians, you probably heard that phrase. So they were starting to bury their dead away from where their settlements were, and putting interesting objects in with the dead. And that just kind of snowballed and eventually became Adena and Hopewell. So it doesn't surprise me that kind of thing was found there. Cincinnati is a super rich area for Native American archaeology, and it's a shame more archaeology wasn't done before all the construction happened, you know, over the last 200 years. But that's the way it goes.
Anyone else? Nope. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Burks, very much for joining us. That was very, very informative.
You're welcome. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully you like archaeology if you sat through all that.
That was a lot of information. Thank you very much. Yes.
So much. Outstanding.
So I'll be in touch with you, and we'll try to get something together with the high school kids volunteering.
Okay, and I will try to remember to email you the next time we're going to do clearing.
Okay.
And then you can send around the message, and anybody who wants to participate can then show up at the right time, right place.
Okay.
So that'd be cool.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you again.
All right, bye everybody.
Good evening.
Bye.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice summer.
Thanks, you too.
I think we have to-